invite James to continue the case in Monash.
The negative team was happy to acknowledge that this debate ultimately came down to a trade-off between short-term stability and long-term democracy. But when the main opposition to an undemocratic coup subsumed itself into the government, you lost the fundamental critique of the structures of power in Egypt that dominated during the regime of Hosni Mubarak, that dominated the interim government, and would continue to dominate any future government of Egypt. You could not have functioning democracy in Egypt when the main source of critique of the army simply opted to let this one go through to the keeper. I want to ask three things in this speech. Firstly, can cooperation with the army and the interim government protect democracy in the long term? Secondly, does this fight polarization? And thirdly, and more substantively, what does this do to democracy in the Middle East, particularly focusing in a more substantive contribution on what this does to other limbs of the Muslim Brotherhood? Firstly, the characterization of the army not being able to trust the Muslim Brotherhood, that they would wrest control of the Muslim Brotherhood, was correct, and that was demonstrated functionally by the fact that a coup had occurred. But the reasons that the affirmative advanced that they would suddenly be trusted within the Muslim Brotherhood were twofold. First was that the government was created by the army, and the second was that there was cooperation with the army. To cooperation. Firstly, this is to some extent a coercive environment here, the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood is giving up a bargaining chip of continuing protest. We do not think that that necessarily results in the kind of broad-based cooperation and trust of the Muslim Brotherhood as an institution. But crucially, and as to the idea that the thing is created by the army, this government is explicitly set up to preserve the influence of the Egyptian military in Egyptian politics. It contains a clause that says the army has a role in providing certain forms of secularized government. The way this operates in countries like Turkey is that the army, whenever it feels the country is becoming too Islamized, moves in to seize control of the state. Of course this feels like there is going to be trust with the Muslim Brotherhood because they've beaten them. They've got them under their thumb and they felt that they've bought into this political structure. This is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be challenged within Egyptian politics, particularly because the kind of drafting measures that are likely to take place here most likely will be ones that exclude the Muslim Brotherhood, regardless of how many cabinet positions they hold, and they never demonstrated why that incentive would not still operate on a dominant government when they said that there were interests of liberals and secularists and Coptic Christians. They did not point to why there was any changed incentive of the government to legislate to remove the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah. We think furthermore that this poisons the incentives of the interests of future governments and the stability of democracy. What Laura said was the alternative was chaos or an authoritarian regime. Sure, we think the continued pressure of the Muslim Brotherhood is one that will serve to continue chaos. And crucially, when the Egyptian populace see that the army cannot maintain stability in the aim of a popular movement that commands 50% of a vote base of 80 million people, that those 40 million people will be able to continue destabilizing a government that aims to lock out the legitimate presence of an Islamic-dominated democracy. But then she said that the legitimacy of institutions were eroded if the Muslim Brotherhood did not opt into this government. That is a foregone conclusion in this debate and this government. The legitimacy of the democratic institutions put in place by an army puppeteer government are always going to be considered questionable. That's why Hosni Mubarak's show elections weren't considered legitimate, and that's why the Muslim Brotherhood boycotted them. There was always going to be distrust of a huge proportion of the Egyptian populace under either model. The fact that the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood were suddenly going to assume that, because they'd been granted a few scraps of power and cabinet positions, things had dramatically changed was unrealistic. But did this fight polarization? The second question. Because the characterization is presented by the affirmative team of the various elements of Islam, ranging from the more moderate Muslim Brotherhood to the more extreme Salafists, that's been contrasted against Coptic Christians and secular liberals, was entirely legitimate, and the idea that they each had tools on disruption were also true. The problem was that just served as an argument for a coalition government. It didn't serve as one in which the interests of a huge swathe of the population were deprioritized and were selectively granted by the interests of the army and by the interests of those, crucially, smaller groups. The fact that Coptic Christians only represent less than 10% of society should not mean that they get to demand the terms on which power is granted to the majority. But if their interest was in placating Salafists don't advocate some form of Muslim Brotherhood buy-in into this government. They advocate for a totally dominated Islamic state that would aim to form part part of a larger Islamic caliphate. And they currently are unhappy about the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood at the last election was their best chance at getting Islamic influence in government. They are the ones that you piss off most, right? The idea that they've seen that democracy has failed to advance their aims, Muslim Brotherhood is not a group that they can count on. That is when you get more radicalized protests. Crucially, that is when you get more violent protests. And that was a problem. It equally well didn't get better institutions for the reasons that I outlined earlier. And finally, it also didn't really serve to placate liberals, because those liberals were agitating for a more democratic process, and we think the idea that democracy is meted by the army is not one that is attractive to liberals there. So they didn't even get the benefits of polarization that they wanted to assert. But then they said that it had broader effects for democracy in the region. The idea that armies around the world served as like authoritarian regimes could act democratically, and that the Muslim Brotherhood could be democratic. To the army. We do not think at all that the army has acted in a democratic manner in this way. Firstly, they removed a dictator, and then they removed a democratically elected government. That did not demonstrate that armies acted sufficiently in a democratic way. But crucially, the idea of negotiation with those authoritarian regimes didn't hold in those other stakeholders either, because the only reason that this is different is the Muslim Brotherhood here has a much bigger ability to leverage protests to kind of like force some degree of engagement with the army in that case. Like that is what the premise of the debate assumes. The Muslim Brotherhood does have some more power here than it would in other circumstances. But then they said that it showed the Muslim Brotherhood could be democratic. We would suggest that the fact that they participated and won elections probably does more to suggest that they can be democratic actors in the best place. We think that they're never going to trust authoritarian regimes that continue to suppress and oppress them. But what does this do to other regimes, to other arms of the Muslim Brotherhood and other important actors? Because crucially, the Muslim Brotherhood does not have a monopoly on Islam, and it does not have a monopoly on Islamism. When you see that in parties like Nada and Noor that have contested variously the Egyptian and Tunisian elections. Secondly, though, the Muslim Brotherhood has had broad-scale support across countries like Yemen, as they pointed out, like countries like Tunisia, and as it was even active in Libya, although Gaddafi wasn't a huge fan of them for a very long time. Crucially, what we think when you have the Muslim Brotherhood like subjugating itself before forces that it pledged in its charter that it would always oppose, like the oppression of army groups, that damages buy-in not only to the Muslim Brotherhood within Egypt, it damages buy-in across the region. It says that the Muslim Brotherhood as an ideological concept, particularly when a lot of its founding leadership were located in Egypt, as it was like primarily an originally Egyptian body, that demonstrates the ideological commitment of the Muslim Brotherhood to an important and like fair Islamist democracy is one that can be compromised at the slightest hint of upset, right? We think that hurts the support of those kind of moderate bodies around the world. But critically, we think it also like damages the engagement of the interim government in a number of ways. So firstly, Qatar and Iran are like currently big, like generally big forms of, Sorry, I've got Iran written there, that's not right. Sorry, Qatar primarily is a big fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. Like, they send large aid flows. They're not going to continue supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, supporting its activities and running like a parallel welfare state when it sees that it's willing to subsume its interests to more authoritarian regimes. Crucially as well, Saudi Arabia and Iran, from like a Wahhabist and Shia millennialist perspective, dislike the involvement of Muslim brothers in the coalition. So what that means is, firstly, you not only irritate those people who are willing to support the Muslim Brotherhood and continue to support the Egyptian government from like a positive perspective, you also irritate those other actors who don't want to see the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood on government anyway. So that it serves to isolate Egypt's crucial regional allies in a way that we think is negative when Egypt is in a state of severe economic disarray. We think that results in the worst possible outcome and leads to the loss of trust of those countries further and into the future. This wasn't a legitimate policy, it wasn't an effective policy, it wasn't one that should be pursued by the brothers.